Hey guys, tonight we begin with the humble meals, metal spoons, and boiled everything of third-ass passengers aboard the RMS Titanic. Because while most people imagine caviar and crystal chandeliers, most passengers were lucky to get boiled potatoes that stayed in one piece, far from the grand dining rooms of first class with their fancy menus and wine lists that looked like Shakespearean plays. The third-ass dining experience was more about calories than elegance, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a little remarkable in its own boiled cabbage way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You expected the worst. When you bought your third-class ticket for the RMS Titanic, you weren't thinking luxury. You were thinking, please let there be a bed, a floor, and something edible that isn't moving. You'd heard the horror stories, steerage passengers crammed into dark, airless spaces with hedges, more rats than spoons. So when you step into the third-ass dining saloon on F deck, you pause, because this actually isn't belle, no hay bales, no visible livestock, and remarkably, it doesn't smell like boiled despair. Instead, you find long wooden tables, real chairs, not crates, and actual walls that are painted white, not peeling white on purpose white. There are electric lights overhead, not candles jammed into turnips, and tiled floors underfoot. You blink. Are you in the right place? You are. This is third class on the Titanic, where you've just been gently but firmly upgraded from steerage livestock to respectable person who uses cutlery. Sure, it's located at the back of the ship, beneath half a continent of wealth and silverware. You're not exactly rubbing elbows with dukes, but for most passengers in your section, this is better than what they had at home. Cleaner, warmer, safer, and with more potatoes per square foot than most Irish farmhouses. You don't get a menu, and you're definitely not choosing between duck, confit, and salmon with dill. But the food is served hot at scheduled times by actual stewards who don't scream at you. You eat at a real table, seated next to other immigrants who, like you, have brought nothing but a suitcase, a goal, and maybe a relative who keeps misplacing their shoes. There's no music, no wine, and the bread might be hard enough to defend yourself with, but the overall feeling is something unfamiliar and oddly wonderful. Dignity. For the first time in a long time, you're not treated like luggage with teeth. You're a passenger. You're welcome here. You walk into the third-ass dining saloon and immediately think, this is too clean. Something's wrong. Where are the leaks? The buckets? The guy selling turnips out of his coat? But no, you're really here. You step carefully across the tiled floor, half expecting it to give way to dirt or disappointment. It doesn't. It's solid, neatly patterned, and dare you say, respectable. The room is long, stretching down the center of F deck, with row after row of sturdy wooden tables and benches. It Feels a bit like a school cafeteria if the school had 700 students. No, blackboard, and everyone brought their own stories and steamer trunks. The tables are bolted to the floor, probably so they don't slide into your lap if the ship tilts. Comforting. Overhead, electric lights glow steadily. Not flickering, not gas-powered. Electric. You'd heard about this sort of thing in newspapers, places with switches and wires that do things without needing candles, oil, or wizardry. Now, here you are heating beneath them, pretending this is all perfectly normal. And then there are the walls, smooth, painted white, and suspiciously free of mildew. Not a single damp patch in sight. You're starting to wonder if you accidentally wandered into second class, but the lack of napkins and the presence of 14 children yelling in 7 different languages quickly reassures you. The air smells like boiled something, probably potatoes with a background note of soap. That last part catches you off guard. Soap in steerage. Someone in White Star Line's design team clearly overachieved. You sit down at a long bench, elbow to elbow, with people you've never met and will likely never understand. A Swedish man nods at you. A Sicilian woman blesses the bread. A child with a spoon the size of their arm is already testing the limits of gravity. This isn't luxury, but it is order. Food served on time in a room with light and space and the faint suggestion of hygiene. You eat together, shoulder to shoulder, not shoved into corners like cargo. And for someone who's crossed countries just for a chance at tomorrow, this dining room, it feels like you've already arrived. If you thought the Titanic's third ass dining room served everyone at once, think again. You quickly learn that eating in steerage is less about meal time and more about strategy. With over 700 passengers vying for stew and chair space, the only way to make it work is the dining equivalent of traffic control, scheduled shifts. You don't get a printed timetable or a polite chime to guide you. It's more organic, a kind of group instinct, like birds migrating. You see people stand, you hear clinking plates, and someone mutters, "It's our turn." That's your cue, your shift. Arrive. You squeeze in, you sit down. You don't ask how long you've got. The answer is less than you'd like. The early diners get everything hot and intact. Bread still softish, stew not, yet mysteriously congealed. These people move with focus like trained professionals. Their elbows are tucked. Their spoons are decisive. It's impressive. Then there's your group, the middle wave. You're the folks who get the lukewarm stew, the chairs that wobble slightly, and the table that smells like regret and carrots. You tell yourself it builds character. And finally, there's the last shift, the stragglers, the stew, survivors. These are the folks eating in slow motion, surrounded by crumbs and chaos, sipping tea that might be dishwater in disguise. They arrive hungry and leave philosophical, but regardless of when you sit, there's an understanding. Eat now, chat later. The food is here, the time is short, and someone is probably already eyeing your seat. Conversations, if they happen at all, are brief and functional. Pass the bread. This fork is warm. Is this cabbage? It was. No one complains, not seriously, because even with the rushed pacing, the shared cutlery, and the occasional mystery ingredient, this is still a luxury compared to what most third-class passengers are used to, and when your turn ends, you stand, clear your plate, and move aside for the next round, like passing the torch in a relay race powered entirely by potatoes and politeness. You return to your cabin a little fuller, a little faster, and with a new appreciation for how many ways a meal can be boiled. Morning comes early on the Titanic, especially in third class, where light filters in from nowhere in particular, and someone's baby is always already crying. You rise, dress, if you call, rubbing yesterday's clothes flat, dressing, and follow the scent of hot carbohydrates toward the dining saloon. Breakfast is served. No bells, no butlers, no dramatic music, just the clatter of dishes and a steward who nods vaguely in your direction, as if to say, yes, it's edible probably. You take your seat and glance around. The mood is focused. It's too early for conversation, too late to go back to bed, and just the right time to eat. Something that will sit in your stomach like a loyal pet for the rest of the day. On the table, a generous portion of porridge, which has the consistency of warm wallpaper paste, but considerably more nutritional value. You don't ask what grain it is. No one does. It's hot, and that's what counts. Beside it, slices of bread that were definitely baked sometime this week. They're thick, plain, and slightly heroic in how determined they are not to crumble. A pat of margarine sits nearby, pretending to be butter, but fooling no one. Then there's the tea. Eternal, reliable, and strong enough to bend a spoon. It arrives in a tin mug, steaming and slightly tannic, with the flavor profile of boiled resolve. It pairs beautifully with the bread. If your goal is hydration and emotional resilience, some lucky tables get marmalade, a citrusy surprise that tastes like sunshine and sugar collided and were caught in a jar. If your table does get a jar, it's guarded like treasure and rationed like medicine. And despite the lack of variety, the meal is surprisingly satisfying. There's no bacon, no eggs, not even a sud little sausage. But you feel nourished, stable, like your digestive system was just handed a warm blanket and told to get comfortable. This is the kind of breakfast that won't wow your taste buds, but it will keep you upright on a swaying ship with no elevator and too many stairs. By noon, your breakfast has fully settled into your soul, and your body politely suggests it's time for another round of starch-based diplomacy. This is the big one, dinner, which is what lunch was called back then, because Edwardians loved confusing future generations. You shuffle into the dining saloon, part of the second or maybe third shift. Who knows? Time aboard ship is measured in meal times, not minutes. The room already smells like steam, gravy, and optimism. The steward places a bowl of soup in front of you. It's hot, vaguely vegetable-like, and remarkably beige. No one's quite sure what's in it, not even the cook. But it's comforting in the same way a warm bath is comforting if the bath included turnips. Then comes the main event, a slab of roast beef, generously described as roast because it was cooked with heat, and beef because it isn't poultry. It's firm, chewy, and determined to be filling. Alongside it, a mountain of boiled potatoes, stacked so high you half expect a goat to start climbing them. There might be gravy, thick and salty, poured generously, not to flavor the meat, but to protect your mers. It binds everything together like edible mortar. A few boiled carrots or peas roll onto your plate, adding color and the illusion of variety. There's bread again, of course, the Titanic equivalent of air. You use it to mop up your plate, signal for more stew, or just chew rhythmically until someone speaks to you. The room is full of chatter now. Swedish, Irish, Italian, Serbian, dozens of languages at once. You nod politely. When someone says something you don't understand and raise your cup of tea, like a toast to international misunderstanding. Nobody is pretending this is fine dining, but nobody's complaining either. You're warm, fed, and sitting down. That's 3 wins right there. You scrape up the last of your potatoes, sit back slightly, and wonder, not for the first time, how something so simple can still feel so satisfying. Then the steward clears your plate, wipes the table, and gestures vaguely toward the door, because somewhere behind you another hungry shift is already lining up. By the time supper rolls around, you've already walked half the ship, lost a game of cards to a suspiciously confident child, and witnessed a minor argument over whose suitcase smells the most like onions. Naturally, you've worked up an appetite. Supper is not as ambitious as dinner or lunch, depending on how confused you still are by Edwardian meal names. It's not here to impress. It's here to gently guide you towards sleep without causing intestinal drama. You take your seat, and once again the stewards deliver a modest spread that says, "Let's not make a fuss, shall we?" On the plate, cold meats sliced thin and arranged with the enthusiasm of a man who has sliced 700 plates of cold meat today. What kind of meat? Nobody asks. It's vaguely pink, mildly seasoned, and thoroughly adequate. You chew thoughtfully, as if pondering its origin will make it taste more exciting. It doesn't. Next to the meat is cheese, usually white, slightly crumbly, and with the personality of a damp brick. Still, it pairs well with the ever-reliable bread, which has become your closest companion on this voyage. The two of you have developed a mutual understanding. You don't question it. It doesn't disappoint you. There's more tea, of course. Always tea. Titanic's third class may not offer wine, or dignity in portion sizes, but it will. Keep your cup full of strong dark brew until the end of time. You sip it slowly, partly to savor it, partly to stall. A few tables down, someone's child is singing, someone else is snoring mid-you, and 2 young men are quietly debating whether this is the best meal they've ever had. Based on how seriously they're arguing, it probably too is. There's no dessert. There's barely fruit, but there is a kind of quiet, comfort in the simplicity of it all. The day is winding down, the lights are dimmer, and the room feels a little less chaotic, like everyone agrees to keep their elbows to themselves. Just for this one meal, you finish the last bite, fold your napkin, if you bothered to pretend you had one, and lean back, full, if not in flavor, then in feeling. Supper's not exciting, but it's warm, it's shared, and most of all, it's enough. At some point during the voyage, as you're sipping your third cup of tea and chewing a piece of bread that could double as roofing material, you start to wonder, where's the beer? After all, it's a celebration. You're crossing the Atlantic. You're off to a new life. You've eaten potatoes 3 times today. If anything deserves a pint, it's this. But here in third class, alcohol is officially not served. It's not forbidden exactly, just discouraged strongly with policy, which in practice means bring your own or prepare to stay. Very sober. That said, you start noticing things. A man at the next table has an oddly shaped flask that he guards like it contains sacred relics. A group of young Irishmen keep returning from deck walks, suspiciously cheerful. One Italian fellow claims his tea is spicy, which is either a linguistic misunderstanding or a flask full of confidence. Word around the saloon is that beer can be purchased, technically, at the Third Ass Bar. Yes, there was a bar. It was small, tucked away, and operated under rules so opaque I think they were designed by ancient monks. You could try to order something. If you were brave, lucky, and spoke fluent Eduardian bureaucratic mumble. Still, for most passengers, third class was a teetotaler's playground. Meals were served with water or tea, full stop. If you wanted variety, you could stir your tea or imagine it came from a vineyard in France. But in truth, most people didn't miss it. They were saving money, watching their children, or still recovering from whatever rough cider they drank before boarding. You weren't on a booze cruise. You were on a floating lifeboat to opportunity. Besides, when you're surrounded by clattering dishes, a number of different accents, and the constant rumble of engines below deck, the last thing you need is someone trying to do the polka on a bread bench. So you take another sip of strong, unsweetened tea, give a knowing nod to the man with the mysterious flask, and remind yourself sobriety has its perks, like remembering where your bunk is and not mistaking a lifeboat for an outhouse at 2 a.m. Eventually, you stop asking what's for dinner and start asking, how many ways can stew exist? Because aboard the Titanic in third class, stew isn't just a dish. It's a lifestyle. You quickly learn that stew appears at any time in any meal, with any ingredients and under any name. Irish stew, meat and vegetable mix, or just hot, it's there. It's always there. And whether it's lunch, supper, or some mysterious in-between snack someone dreamed up during a rough patch of sea, a stew is the star of the show. Now, don't get too excited. This isn't a delicate, slow-cooked masterpiece with notes of thyme and bay leaf. No, this stew is practical. It's a dense, boiling solution. of meat-like substances, root, vegetables, and determination. It tastes mostly of salt, resilience, and the ghost of a turnip. Still, it's not bad. It's warm, it's filling. It has a way of sticking to your ribs, which is another way of saying you'll still feel it tomorrow, and you're oddly grateful for that. Everyone around you treats the stew with respect. You'll see full-grown men staring into their bowls like philosophers, silently considering whether that chunk floating in the broth is mutton, beef, or just particularly muscular parsnip. You learn to eat it quickly, not because it's so delicious. You can't wait, but because the temperature is best described as lava, adjacent. If you don't catch it at the right moment, it'll either scald your tongue or solidify into something closer to cement. What's impressive is how the kitchen staff makes so much of it, enough to feed hundreds of passengers daily, all from what must be the world's most heroic cauldron. One imagines a sweating cook stirring the pot with an oar, muttering encouragement to the greed carrots. Of course, there are no seconds. This isn't a buffet. You eat what you're given, smile politely, and pretend you didn't just bite into something that might have once been cabbage or possibly shoe leather. Before your first meal aboard the Titanic, you might have assumed you'd be eating with your hands or possibly a splintered stick, someone carved into a spoon. After all, you're in third class. Expectations are low, so it's a pleasant shock when a steward hands you actual cutlery, not gold-plated, not engraved, with a family crest, but clean, metal, functional, and most importantly, matching. You briefly consider framing it. You receive a fork, a spoon, and on special occasions, a knife that has clearly been sharpened on a rock at some point in the last century. Still, it cuts mostly. Eventually, your plates are white enamel, durable, and slightly chipped, like they've seen some things, but don't want to talk about it. They clink gently as they're laid out, announcing to everyone that dinner is officially serious business. And then there's the mug, a thick ceramic or tin cup with no handle and no apology. It holds tea, water, or whatever slightly suspicious liquid appears next. It is also unofficially a hand warmer, a percussion instrument, and when necessary, a weapon of light intimidation. You grow fond of it quickly. Napkins? Don't get greedy. You have a sleeve, a neighbor's elbow, and the vague hope that the gravy will stay on the plate this time. The tables themselves are bolted to the floor, presumably to prevent any Titanic-style dinner slide during choppy seas. The benches are long, communal, and just wide enough to sit without ever quite relaxing. You learn to balance, lean, and brace yourself with the core strength of a circus performer. Eating, as it turns out, is a full-body sport. Despite the simplicity, there's something almost noble in how these tools are used. You, your fellow passengers, and a spoon that once served 12 different nationalities, all sharing space, all chasing stew across a plate. And when the meal ends, you don't toss your cutlery in a bin. You place it neatly because this is the Titanic, and even in third class there are standards, sort of. You rise from the table, still, chewing slightly, and glance at your spoon one last time before it's cleared away. At some point, probably mid-chew, of your fourth boiled potato of the voyage, you find yourself wondering who's actually making all this food. Because it's not just you, it's hundreds of passengers eating 3 meals a day, plus tea, bread, and whatever that stew was pretending to be. That's not just cooking, that's a logistical miracle. The answer lies deep in the belly of the ship, where the third ass galley is, tucked away like a secret you're not meant to know about. You'll never see it unless you sneak down there, which, let's be honest, you're probably too full and too polite to attempt. Down in the galley, an army of cooks and assistants labor with military precision and the stamina of caffeinated badgers. They're not celebrity chefs. They don't sign autographs, but they can peel, chop, and stir for 700 people without crying, which makes them heroes in any 2nd century. Their tools are industrial-sized cauldrons that could comfortably house a family of badgers if necessary. These iron beasts are used to boil meat, stew vegetables, and possibly hide the occasional shoe. Everything is massive, pots the size of bathtubs, ladles like O's, and bread, trays that double as small sleds. If you're feeling rebellious, menus are prepared with ruthless efficiency. There's no room for flair or personal interpretation. Nobody's saying, let's add a twist of lemon zest to this stew. No, you add carrots if you have carrots. You subtract meat if you ran out of animal. And yet somehow the food appears regularly hot, occasionally edible, miraculously filling. There's something admirable about the whole operation. The invisible labor of men and women sweating through aprons, yelling over roaring stoves. Also, a third ass passenger. Like you can wonder, is this beef? While smearing margarine on a bloquet slice of bread that predates the iceberg, you raise your spoon in quiet tribute to them. They'll never hear your praise. They're too busy preparing 700 more servings of tea, and possibly talking to the stew like it's a living being. But without them, this voyage would be a lot more miserable and a lot more raw. Once you've survived a few meals aboard Titanic in 3rd class, you notice a pattern, a kind of dining choreography that unfolds like clockwork. It goes like this: sit, nod, eat like the ship's sinking, leave. Because here's the thing, you're on a timer, not an official one, mind you. There's no steward blowing a whistle or flipping a sand glass. But when 700 people need to eat in a space built for half that, the pressure is real. Lingering over your cabbage is frowned upon. The moment your food hits the table, it's a race between your appetite and the next shift. Everyone around you adopts a similar rhythm. Heads down, elbows tucked, spoons moving at survival speed. It's like synchronized chewing, less romantic, more utilitarian. Conversation happens, but only in brief bursts. A muttered pass, the bread, a sharp, "That's my cup," or the ocasional, philosophical debate over whether that was beef or just aggressively seasoned carrot. You try to make eye contact with the steward once, just to say thanks, but they vanish like ghosts, whisking away plates before you even set down your spoon. These people move with the stealth of ninjas and the focus of caffeine-fueled librarians. There's no time for social pleasantries, no small talk about weather or dreams, or the pros and cons of cabbage-based existence. Even laughter, when it happens, is hurried, as if joy has to squeeze in between bites of stew and gulps of lukewarm tea. You've never respected digestion so much. Every swallow is an act of precision. You don't waste time chewing anything more than absolutely necessary. You've seen veterans around you dismantle a plate in 2 minutes flat and still have time to butter a second roll expertly, and just when you think, maybe I'll sit a bit longer, just a sip of tea, someone behind you coughs politely, or not so politely. A clear signal, time's up, stew soldier. So you rise, nod to the table, a goodbye. Ritual between strangers bonded by boiled roots, and step aside for the Drent. Next group, in third class, meals aren't just nourishment. You might have boarded the Titanic expecting to eat with people who spoke your language, dressed like you, and maybe shared your fondness for root vegetables. But no, the third S, dining room, is less a quiet mess hall and more of a continental buffet of humanity. You sit elbow to elbow with strangers from everywhere: Ireland, Sweden, Syria, Italy, Poland, and some places you only vaguely recognize from a map you once saw in church. There's no seating chart. No one's organizing you by nationality or profession. It's just whoever showed up at the same moment you did, holding a spoon and a hopeful attitude at your table. A Swedish carpenter who eats with the precision of a surgeon, an Entienit Irish widow with 5 kids, and the aura of a general, and a Serbian grandmother who communicates almost exclusively through eyebrow raises and disapproving glances at the bread. No one knows each other, but within 5 minutes you all become part of an unspoken contract. Don't take more than your share, laugh quietly, and never judge anyone's technique with margarine. The languages around you collide into a symphony of mutters, mumbles, and half smiles. You might hear 5 different prayers before the soup even hits the dot table. Sometimes people translate for one another. Sometimes you just shrug and pass the salt, which might not actually be salt, but you're too polite to ask. Occasionally someone tries to make conversation beyond the standard stew commentary. It's usually about where you're going, who you left behind, or whether you think this bread could stop a bullet. You respond carefully, because even without words, everyone here is balancing excitement and fear in equal portions. It's a strange kind of intimacy, sharing a table with strangers on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, none of you entirely sure what you'll find on the other side. But somehow the stew helps. It's universal. It transcends borders. It brings people together through the shared struggle of figuring out what's floating in it. You leave the meal without knowing everyone's name, but you remember the way the Italian girl laughed, how the Norwegian boy shared his marmalade, and the way that Serbian grandmother silently judged your spoon grip. By now, you've grown accustomed to third S, dining, the stews, the tea, the thrilling unpredictability of meat, origins. But eventually, curiosity creeps in. You start wondering what the upper decks are up to. Specifically, what are they eating? And more painfully, what aren't? You? For starters, there's no dessert in third class, not even a tired pudding, pretending to be festive. You get bread, you get stew, you get the occasional mystery vegetable. But if you want something sweet, you'd better hope someone dropped a raisin on the floor. Meanwhile, first-class passengers are up there, enjoying 10-course meals with names you can't pronounce and ingredients that sound fictional. Peach compost with chartreuse jelly. You'd settle for a baked apple and a nap. There's also no menu choice. You don't get to request your favorite dish. You eat what's given to you. No substitutions, no customizing, no questions. If you don't like the stew, you can write it a stern letter and move on. No wait staff introductions either. In first class, stewards probably whisper things like, "Your roast, madam, aged precisely 21 days. In third class, a man sets down your plate and disappears like a ghost in an apron. And forget about table linens, centerpieces, or candlelight. Your table is wiped down with whatever's available, possibly someone's sleeve, and you're lucky if your spoon isn't still damp from someone else's tea. Alcohol. Still no. We've covered this, but it stings a little more when you hear about the elaborate wine pairings upstairs, while you're still wringing flavor out of your third cup of tea. Even fruit is a rare sight. In first class, they're nibbling grapes and slicing oranges with golden forks. Down here, you'd cause a stampede if you pulled a banana out of your pocket. And yet, despite the absence of trimmings, the lack of flair, and the general scarcity of dessert, the third-ass dining room never feels bitter, just pragmatic. You might not get the frills, but you get fed, you get warmth, you get company, and you get that one satisfying moment where someone passes the bread without being asked. By now you've settled into a kind of rhythm. Wake, eat, avoid stampedes of children, repeat. The meals may be simple, but they arrive on time, and they keep your stomach quiet mostly. And then comes Sunday, the 14th of April. You don't know it yet, but this will be the last supper ever served in Titanic's third-ass saloon. Dinner that evening is on paper unremarkable. More stew, more boiled potatoes, maybe a bit of roast pork if the kitchen staff were feeling fancy. You notice the bread is a little fresher, or maybe it's just your imagination trying to inject sentiment into a dinner roll. People eat, as usual, hungrily, efficiently, quietly. There's laughter in the air, couples celebrating their engagement, boys showing off a harmonica, and someone just spilled tea on a child who's now thrilled to have attention. No one suspects anything. Why would they? You chat briefly with the man next to you. Something about where you'll land in New York. You joke that if the ship keeps feeding you like this, you might arrive heavier than when you boarded. It's not a great joke, but it earns a chuckle. There's a sense of hope hanging in the room, Like everyone believes the future is just over the next wave. You see parents calming babies, young men trading dreams, older folks quietly, staring into their mugs like they're reading omens in the tea leaves. You finish your meal, the last chunk of meat, the last sip of tea, and rise. Same as always. You don't know this is the last time you'll do this. That's the strange thing. Final moments rarely announce themselves. You return to your bunk thinking about breakfast. You wonder if they'll serve marmalade again. You hope you're in the early shift. You're pretty sure you're finally learning how to butter the bread without splitting it in half like a poorly built raft. Outside, the ship steams forward into the North Atlantic night. Inside, the third-ass dining room sits quiet, empty, clean. No one knows it's over. Not yet. After everything, the stew, the tea, the bread you could patch a roof with, what remains? You survived on food that wouldn't win prizes, served in shifts, without menus, and without much ceremony. And yet, it fed you, not just your stomach, but something quieter, something harder to name. When news of the sinking spread, the world's attention naturally turned to the grand staircase, the gilded dining rooms, the orchestra playing as the ship went down. Understandably dramatic. But somewhere below all that, on F deck, in a plain white-walled room, with tiled floors and benches bolted to the ground, there were stories too. Third-house passengers weren't sipping champagne. They were clutching bread, rolls, wrapping coats around, sleeping, children, and wondering how anyone could drown in something as big and modern as Titanic. Some would later recall the dining room as the last place they sat in peace, the last place they felt hopeful, the last place where everything was still ordinary. Of course, much of it was lost. Tables, benches, pots the size of bathtubs, all swallowed by the sea. The menus were never printed, the soup recipes never published, and no one took photographs of your spoon. History rarely asks what the humble were eating, but if you listen, you can still hear it. Not just the clang of cutlery, but the clatter of languages, the bubbling of stew, the quiet thanks before meals. You hear mothers cutting bread into equal parts, fathers pretending to like cabbage, children licking tin cups and laughing at nothing. That dining room was never fancy. It didn't try to be. It was functional, warm, and maybe a little too enthusiastic about potatoes. But it was also shared, enduring, and human. In a ship divided by class, it was a rare space where community bloomed, without linen, wine lists, or orchestras. And though it sits at the bottom of the Atlantic now, somewhere under a century's worth of water and myth, that room and those meals mattered. In 53 CE, one of the greatest mysteries of Roman military history began with a disaster. Marcus Licinius Cassius, Rome's wealthiest man and a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, led 7 legions eastward into Parthian territory. His goal was simple: to gain military glory and of line of secure Roman dominance in the east. But instead, he marched into catastrophe. At the Battle of Carrhae, near the edge of modern-day Turkey, Kraus found himself face to face with the Parthian Empire, masters of desert warfare and horse archery. Despite commanding roughly 40,000 Roman troops, Cassius had underestimated his enemy. The Parthians, led by General Serena, brought only about 10,000 cavalry, but their mobility and relentless volleys of arrows proved devastating. Roman formations built for close-quarter combat and set-piece battles were helpless in the open plains. Over 2 days, the Parthians encircled and decimated the Roman forces. Kraus's son, Publius, died early in the battle, surrounded and overwhelmed. Kraus himself was lured into a peace negotiation and executed, his head allegedly used in a Parthian theatrical performance as a prop. By the end, some 20,000 Romans were dead, but another 10,000 or more were missing. Not dead, not recovered, simply vanished. And it is here, in the aftermath of K, that the mystery begins. Contemporary Roman sources suggest that thousands of Roman soldiers were captured and taken deep into Parthian territory, likely used as labor or soldiers along the empire's eastern frontier. But what happened to them after that? For centuries, no one could say. Then, many years later, Chinese records would surface, mentioning strange foreign troops with unusual fighting formations. Troops who fought in a style not known to any Asian army of the time. Could these missing Romans have made it even farther east into Central Asia, or even China itself? The idea sounds like historical fantasy, but the silence surrounding these vanished soldiers has only deepened the intrigue. They were not ordinary prisoners. They were trained legionaries, disciplined, skilled, and valuable. And in the ancient world, such men were often reused rather than wasted. Thus began the legend of the lost Roman legion. And as strange clues began to emerge from ancient Chinese texts and Central Asian towns, historians started to wonder, had Roman soldiers truly made it to the Far East, or was it all myth built on the bones of a battlefield? After the catastrophic defeat at Kar, the Parthians were left with thousands of Roman captives, possibly as many as 10,000 men. These were not auxiliary forces or raw recruits. They were seasoned legionaries, the backbone of the Roman military machine. And while Rome mourned its dead and seethed with rage, the Parthians saw opportunity. Rather than executing or enslaving all the survivors, Parthian leaders, particularly General Serena, chose a more strategic approach. They dispersed the prisoners across their empire, settling many in the northeastern borderlands, far from the Roman frontier. Ancient sources suggest some of these soldiers were relocated to Margana, modern-day MV in Turkmenistan. This oasis city, located near the edge of the Central Asian steppes, was a vital eastern outpost for the Parthian Empire. There, it's believed the Romans were integrated into the local military infrastructure. The Parthians were not fools. They had seen firsthand the effectiveness of Roman discipline, formations, and engineering. Using these men as border guards, construction laborers, or even as special units in their own armies made practical sense. Mariana, constantly threatened by nomadic invasions would have been an ideal location to station foreign troops, far enough from their homeland to prevent rebellion, but close enough to defend the empire's fringes. But here, the historical record grows silent. Roman writers like Plutarch mention the defeat, the humiliation, and the death toll, but very little about the fate of the captured. Pantheon records, sparse and fragmented, offer little in return. The soldiers seem to vanish into the desert sands. It's from this silence that speculation grows. Some suggest that the Romans intermarried with locals, gradually losing their identity over generations. Others believe that a core group remained cohesive, retained their military structure, and continued to serve as a mercenary or auxiliary unit, far from Rome's reach, and yet, Century later, curieux reports begin to appear in Chinese historical records. These documents describe a mysterious group of warriors who used a fish-scale formation unlike anything seen in traditional Asian warfare. Could these accounts be referring to those same Roman captives? If so, then the Roman legionnaires who marched to Kir, expecting gold and conquest, may have instead helped shape the history of a distant land forgotten by the empire they once served. The road east was long, but perhaps not impossible. Nearly 150 years after the Battle of Kir, the curious entry appears in the official chronicles of the Han Dynasty. It describes a battle in 36 BCE in the Pointe-de-Vue far western reaches of China, between Han forces and a Central Asian ruler named Shi Chanu of the Xiongnu. The battle took place near the city of Shi's fortress in modern-day Kazakhstan, along the Talis River. According to the Han historian Banu in the Book of Han, Chinese generals reported encountering Aziz Vives, a blessed, strange unit of foreign soldiers in Shi's army. These men fought in a fish-scale formation, a term the Chinese used to describe a tight shielded formation that moved as one, strikingly similar to the Roman Tudo or tortoise formation. No Central Asian army was known to use such tactics. The description stood out, even in the term military account. This anomaly has led some scholars to wonder, could these strange troops have been remnants of the Roman legion captured at Carrhae? If the prisoners were indeed sent east to Margiana and gradually moved across Central Asia, whether through migration, mercenary service, or forced transfer, reaching the court of Jigi is not beyond imagination. Adding to the intrigue is the scale of Gigi's ambitions. He built a massive stone fortress, unusual for nomadic Oud leaders, and assembled an army with advanced tactics and foreign advisors. Might Roman-trained soldiers have contributed to his defenses? In the final siege, Chinese sources say, these foreign troops fought bravely, using their formation to protect the Prosely's fortress walls until they were overwhelmed by Han forces. After the defeat, the Han reportedly captured many of these fighters. While most were executed, some were taken east, into China, possibly resettled in the Bliss, western frontier regions. One village in particular stands out, Liqian. Liqian, located in the Gansu province, bears a name strikingly similar to Legion. Local legends, unusual facial features among inhabitants, and persistent rumors of Roman ancestry have fueled speculation. For decades, some even claim Roman coins and artifacts were found there, though these discoveries remain controversial and difficult to verify. Could this village be the final resting place of Rome's lost sons, or is it simply a case of historical coincidence and cultural myth-making? The trail is faint but tantalizing, and the deeper one digs, the stranger it becomes. Tucked into the dry landscapes of China's Gansu province lies a small village with an outsized reputation, Lysian. For decades, this remote settlement has attracted the attention of historians, geneticists, and the simply curious because of a legend that won't die. According to some theories, Lysian may be the final resting place of the lost Roman legionaries captured at Kai and carried eastward across Asia. The story begins with the name itself. Lycian appears in Chinese records as early as the Han dynasty and is believed by some scholars to be a transliteration of Legion or Roma. During the Han era, Lysian was considered a frontier outpost far from the imperial heartland and a logical location to resettle foreign prisoners of war. Over time, whispers began to circulate that the people of Lycian weren't entirely Chinese. What kept the legend alive was the village's appearance. Early 20th century Western travelers claimed to find individuals with unusually fair hair, light eyes, and aquiline noses, features not commonly found in the region. Photographs were taken, skulls were measured, and the theory that Lycian's residents were descended from Romans began to spread in popular media. A number of articles and books in the 20th and 21st centuries fanned the flames, treating the idea with varying degrees of skepticism and enthusiasm. In recent decades, DNA testing has been conducted on Lycian residents. The results were inconclusive. Some genetic markers common in Western populations appeared, but nothing definitively Roman. Critics argue that Central Asia has always been a crossroads of diverse ethnic groups, and such traits could come from centuries of Silk Road intermixing. Still, the persistence of the story and the village's embrace of it continues to draw attention. Lycian has leaned into its mythical heritage. Roman-themed statues stand at the village entrance. Tourists are greeted with faux centurion performances and vendors selling Roman souvenirs. Whether grounded in truth or legend, the Lost Legion has become a cultural identity for the village and a point of pride for its residents. Yet the question remains unresolved. Did Roman soldiers truly settle here, or is Lycian's story a fascinating fusion of coincidence, local lore, and wishful thinking? If truth hides beneath the myth, it's buried deep beneath centuries of sand, silence, and empire. But one thing is certain: the journey of the Lost Legion did not end at Kari, and Lycian may be the last whisper of Rome in the East. Has the legend of Lycian gained international attention? The natural next step was science. Could DNA evidence prove or disprove the prevalent tale of Roman descendants in China? In the early 2000s, Chinese geneticists, working in collaboration with international researchers, collected blood samples from several villages in Lycian aiming to analyze their genetic ancestry. The results sparked headlines, controversy, and more questions than answers. The initial studies claimed that about 56% of the sampled villages had genetic markers, more commonly found in European populations than in East Asian ones. This was touted by some as confirmation of the Roman theory. Newspapers ran with the story. Headlines suggested that the mystery of the lost legion had finally been solved, and television crews descended on the village to capture what seemed like living proof of ancient Roman wanderers in China. But the scientific community was quick to caution against jumping to conclusions. Geneticists pointed out that the markers found in Lycian villages weren't uniquely Roman or even uniquely European. Central Asia has been a melting pot for millennia, with people moving east and west across the Silk Road long before and long after the Battle of Kay. Traders, mercenaries, nomads, and migrants could have brought those genes into the population at any point. Furthermore, later peer-reviewed studies failed to replicate the initial results. More comprehensive DNA testing showed that the villages of Layan were genetically consistent with nearby Han Chinese populations. The so-called European traits could easily be explained by regional variation or centuries of intermixing with Central Asian peoples who carried a similar appearance. Still, the idea refused to die. Some argued that even if genetic proof remained elusive, the cultural, linguistic, and historical breadcrumbs couldn't be ignored. Others insisted that the romantic appeal of the story had outpaced the evidence. The scientific consensus leans toward skepticism, but the absence of definitive disproof keeps the door open, if only slightly. Ultimately, genetics offered no smoking gun. It neither confirmed nor definitively refuted the legend of Roman legionaries in China, but it did highlight something deeper: how stories endure not just through bloodlines, but through belief, and belief, it seems, is harder to silence than science. The quest for answers continues, not just in Lycian, but in the broader historical and archaeological record. Perhaps the key to this mystery lies not in genes, but in ruins, records, and roads half buried in dust. While the genetic evidence remains inconclusive, many historians and archaeologists have turned to a different kind of proof: artifacts. Could physical remains, coins, weapons, fortifications, or burial sites support the theory of a Roman presence deep in Asia? The search has taken scholars across Central Asia and Western China, yet the trail remains tantalizingly faint. In and around the region of Lian, a number of Roman-style artifacts have reportedly been found over the decades, most notably coins, fragments of armor, and even tools resembling Roman construction implements. Some local museums and tourism boards have claimed these items as proof of Roman roots, adding fuel to the legend. But in almost every case, experts have urged caution. Many of these artifacts either lack verified provenance, are inconsistent with known Roman designs, or could easily have arrived via trade. Roman coins, for example, have been found across Central Asia including in areas like Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Western China. But their presence doesn't necessarily imply settlement. The Silk Road was a vast commercial artery, and Roman goods were traded thousands of miles from the empire's borders. A Roman coin in a Chinese grave might be no more significant than a Chinese tea bowl in a Viking burial. Curious, but not proof of migration. One of the most intriguing but unconfirmed leads is the possibility of Roman-style fortifications in the Roman-style fortifications. Talis River region, where the Han army clashed with Shichanu in 36 BCE. Some researchers have speculated that the stone-walled fortress described in Chinese sources might have been built with Roman assistance given its unusual construction for nomadic groups. Yet, no excavation has revealed explicitly Roman architectural technique or inscriptions. A major obstacle in confirming the legend archaeologically is the lack of inscriptions or written records. The Romans were prolific record keepers, yet no Latin writing has ever been found in these supposed eastern outposts. Without inscriptions, it becomes exceedingly difficult to tie any structure or object directly to a Roman legion. In the end, the archaeological silence is both frustrating and fascinating. It leaves just enough room for doubt and just enough for hope. Because in history, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and perhaps in some forgotten valley beneath untouched earth, the story of Rome in the East still waits to be unearthed. To understand whether a Roman legion could truly have reached China, one must first consider the nature of the Roman Empire and its relationship with the East. Rome was expansive, but its reach had limits. The empire stretched from the misty shores of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, but beyond Parthia lay a world Rome knew only through whispers, the mysterious land of Saraka, China. The Romans were aware of China, though they knew it only vaguely. Trade flowed along the Silk Road, bringing silk, spices, jade, and other goods westward. Roman elites treasured Chinese silk, though they believed it to grow on trees or be combed from the leaves of unknown plants. The Chinese likewise knew of a distant empire to the west called Darkin, which scholars now agree referred to Rome. However, contact between the two civilizations was sporadic and indirect. Merchants, intermediaries, and translators carried goods and rumors across deserts and mountains, but no official envoy from Rome ever reached the Chinese imperial court. The closest known attempt came in 166 CE, when a delegation claiming to represent Andun, thought to be the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, arrived in China. Yet scholars suspect the envoys were merchants seeking prestige. So if formal contact between the empires barely occurred, how likely is it that a group of Roman soldiers ended up in China? The idea isn't entirely implausible. The Silk Road was not just a trade route. It was a corridor of movement where soldiers, mercenaries, and displaced peoples sometimes found new homes. The Parthians had both motive and means to redeploy Roman captives to their eastern frontiers, and local rulers like Ji Chanu often recruited foreign soldiers to strengthen their armies. It's also worth noting that Rome did garrison troops in distant and inhospitable places, sometimes for decades. Soldiers in frontier regions were accustomed to cultural blending, intermarriage, and adapting to local customs. A legion fragmented by war, stripped of command, and absorbed into another culture could plausibly survive, evolve, and be forgotten. Still, it remains a leap from likely dispersal in Parthia to military service in Central Asia to settlement in China. The silence of Roman historians on such a migration is deafening, and yet the very possibility speaks to Rome's legacy, not merely as a political power, but as a human story that stretched far beyond its maps. And if such a story did occur, its final chapter may not be about Rome or China at all, but about how myth and memory entwine. The legend of the lost Roman legion in the East endures, not because of overwhelming evidence, but because it occupies that tantalizing space between what is known and what might be true. It's a story of possibility, one that appeals to historians, romantics, and adventurers alike. The very idea of Roman soldiers settling in a far-off land, building new lives under foreign skies, is irresistible. For centuries, empires have been built on conquest, but remembered through legend, and the tale of the lost legion has all the right ingredients. A dramatic defeat, a vanishing army, ancient records hinting at strange foreign troops, and a distant village whose residents seem just different, enough to stir the imagination. The fact that no hard proof has ever emerged only adds to its mystique. Every gap in the historical record becomes an invitation for speculation. But myth is not without value. Even if no Roman soldiers ever set foot in Leon, the story reveals how cultures construct identity through narrative. For the villagers of Leon, the Roman connection, however speculative, has become part of their heritage. It has shaped local tourism, scholarship, and even personal pride. Likewise, for Romans past and modern readers today, the idea that a Roman military thread might have been woven into the fabric of China challenges our understanding of what Rome was. It's also a story about the nature of memory, how wars are remembered, how the defeated are forgotten, and how the human instinct to explain the unexplainable turns silence into legend. That 10,000 trained Roman soldiers could disappear entirely is hard to accept. So, we imagine that they didn't vanish. They transformed. They marched not westward in retreat, but eastward into destiny. Modern technology may one day confirm or dismiss the legend definitively, but until that day comes, the lost legion remains a powerful symbol of endurance, of cultural diffusion, and of the deep currents of human movement that defy neat boundaries. If nothing else, the legend reminds us that history isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it survives in the echoes of ancient roads, in forgotten languages, in the tilt of an eye or the curve of a shield, and in the stories we choose to tell. And that brings us to the final question. Does it really matter if the legend is true, if it has already become real in the minds of so many? Whether or not Roman soldiers ever reached China, The story of the Lost Legion has carved out a legacy far greater than a mere footnote in military history. It has sparked decades of inquiry, redefined the boundaries of cross-cultural contact in the ancient world, and shown how a single event can echo across continents and centuries. At its heart, this legend is not just about missing soldiers. It's about the limits of empire, the resilience of people, and the strange places where cultures intersect. Rome, for all its roads and conquests, was never isolated, nor was China. The Silk Road stitched together far-flung worlds, not only through goods, but through ideas, languages, beliefs, and, yes, people, soldiers, merchants, diplomats, and captives crisscrossed Eurasia in ways historians are still uncovering. The story also forces us to reconsider the shape of historical memory. Ancient sources rarely follow up on the fate of common soldiers, especially after a defeat. But that doesn't mean their stories ended at the last recorded battle. Many were absorbed into new worlds, leaving no record behind. Yet some of them, through custom, tradition, or genetic footprint, may have helped shape the cultures they were absorbed into. The legend of the Lost Legion isn't merely a historical riddle, it's a metaphor. It reflects how empires rise and fall, but people adapt. How trained fighters can become farmers, fathers, or foreigners. How the Roman eagle carried to the ends of the earth might not have returned to Rome, but might have taken root elsewhere, in Leon. Truth and myth have fused. Whether the village holds the bloodline of Roman legionaries or not, its people have inherited the story and chosen to make it part of their identity. And in doing so, they've become a living example of history's most enduring lesson, that the past isn't static. It evolves, reshaped by every generation that tells its story anew. So maybe the Lost Legion never built a fortress in China. Maybe it never adopted the Tudor beneath Han banners. Maybe it simply vanished. But the mystery lives on, not in ruins or DNA, but in the quiet belief that history is full of roads not taken, or simply not yet found, and perhaps somewhere beneath ancient soil, the bones of Rome still wait. Long before the names of Socrates or Confucius echoed through history, a woman in ancient Mesopotamia carved her place into the foundation of human intellectual heritage. Her name was Anheduana, and she is widely considered the first known author in world history, man or woman. She lived around 2300 BCE in the city of Ur in what is now southern Iraq. More than a religious figure, she was a priestess, poet, political thinker, and scholar who shaped the spiritual and intellectual life of her civilization. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the ruler who united the Sumerian and Adian city-states into one of the world's first empires. Appointed as the high priestess of the moon god and Nana in the city of Enheduanna wielded immense influence in both religious and political spheres. But it was her voice preserved in clay tablets that ensured her place in intellectual history. She wrote a series of temple hymns and theological poems, including the famous exaltation of Inanna, which not only praised the goddess of love and war, but also spoke to Enheduanna's personal devotion, struggles, and insights. Her writings are rich with metaphor, structure, and emotion. They reflect a mind capable of merging theology with statecraft, poetry with power. Enheduanna wasn't writing anonymously. She signed her works, declaring I, Enheduanna, composed this. That act of claiming authorship was revolutionary. It asserted a woman's voice in a domain dominated by kings, scribes, and priests. Her compositions weren't passive rituals. They were frameworks of ideology. They helped standardize worship across Sumer and Akkad, subtly supporting her father's political integration of diverse peoples under one empire. Even more remarkably, her work was copied and studied for centuries after her death. Some of her poems survived well into the Babylonian period, used in scribal schools as models of literary excellence. Her language, a blend of Sumerian and Adian traditions, was itself an intellectual bridge, and Enheduanna was not an exception. She was the first in a long, often hidden line of women who shaped philosophy, medicine, and art, long before their names were widely remembered. And though clay tablets weather with time, her voice, etched in uniform, remains a declaration. Women have always been thinkers, builders, and architects of thought. In ancient Egypt, women were not only respected as mothers, wives, and priestesses, they were also practitioners of science, especially in the realm of medicine. Among the most notable was Perpetua, often called the first female physician in recorded history. She lived around 2400 BCE during the 5th dynasty, and her tomb inscriptions describe her as the overseer of women physicians. That title alone is remarkable. It suggests not only that she practiced medicine herself, but that she supervised an entire cadre of female healers. Egyptian medicine was deeply advanced for its time. Physicians had access to detailed anatomical knowledge, partly from the embalming process. They studied disease, injury, fertility, and childbirth. Many medical papyri, like the Kahun gynecological papyrus, indicate that female health was treated as a serious and specialized field. Women treated other women, particularly in matters of pregnancy, birth, and contraception. They used surgical tools, pecuses, herbal medicines, and even complex diagnosis based on symptoms and observation. Though Pesach is the most documented, she likely stood among many learned women. Temples, especially those devoted to goddesses like Hathor or Sekhmet, functioned as centers of healing. Priestesses trained in ritual and herbal medicine often doubled as midwives and healers. These women were not mere assistants. They were scholars in their own right, memorizing long, complex medical texts, often passed down orally or inscribed on scrolls. Education for women in ancient Egypt, especially from elite or priestly families, was not uncommon. Girls learned to read and write hieroglyphics if their status allowed it, and within temple schools they could rise through ranks, gaining access to sacred and scientific knowledge alike. The boundary between religion and science was fluid in Egyptian thought, and women moved within that space with surprising authority. Despite the passage of millennia, the names of most of these early scholars have been lost. Their contributions survive only in fragments, recipes, diagnosis, roles listed in tombs, and the tools buried with them. Yet their legacy is unmistakable. In a world where female education would later be restricted for centuries, ancient Egypt stands as a testament to a time when women were trusted not just with life, but with knowledge. And in other corners of the ancient world, similar patterns were emerging, particularly in Greece, where one woman in the city of Cyrene dared to challenge the male monopoly on philosophy. In the Greek city of Cyrene, located in what is now modern-day Libya, philosophy wasn't just a male endeavor. There, around the 4th century BCE, lived a woman named Arete of Cyrene, one of the few female philosophers known by name from the classical world. She was not a quiet observer in a male-dominated discipline. Was a teacher, a thinker, and a transmitter of philosophical ideas that would ripple through generations. Arete was the daughter of Aristippus, a student of Socrates, and the founder of the Cyrenaic school of philosophy. This school emphasized personal happiness, pleasure, and inner freedom, though not in the hedonistic sense it's often misunderstood as. It taught that mental pleasures were superior to physical ones, and that true contentment came from moderation and self-control. Raised in this intellectual environment, Arete absorbed her father's teachings and eventually inherited his role. Sources suggest she taught philosophy for over 35 years, instructing hundreds of students, including her own son, Aristus the Younger, also known as Mother Taught. This title wasn't poetic. He earned it because his philosophical education came directly from her, not from male tutors or schools. Her contributions are mostly preserved through mentions by later writers such as Dionysius Laertius, who acknowledged her leadership within the Cyrenaic tradition. Though no surviving texts are directly attributed to Arete, her influence is evident in the continued development of her father's ideas that emphasized rational ethics, intellectual liberty, and the pursuit of inner peace. These were not trivial lessons in a world dominated by rigid hierarchies and public spectacle. They were tools for resilience and personal sovereignty. In a culture where most women were expected to remain silent and unseen, Arete stood at the head of a philosophical school guiding male and female minds alike. She challenged the prevailing notion that reason and intellect were male domains. Through her teaching, she proved that women could shape philosophical systems, not just follow them. Aria's story, like many ancient female scholars, survives only in fragments, but those fragments are powerful. They remind us that philosophy has never truly belonged to one gender, and from Cyrene's sunlit courtyards, her voice still echoes, quiet but unbroken, through the annals of thought. In ancient Rome, where public life was dominated by men and political speech was considered a male privilege, one woman dared to take the podium and delivered one of the most legendary orations in Roman history. Her name was Hortensia, daughter of the famed orator Quintus Hortensius Hortalis, and she became a scholar of rhetoric in her own right. But she was more than a student of speech. She was a woman who used her voice to challenge the Roman state itself. The year was 42 BCE. Rome was in political chaos. Julius Caesar was dead, and his successors, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, needed funds to wage war against his assassins. To raise money, they proposed taxing the wealthiest Roman citizens. Unusually, this included taxing wealthy women, even though Roman women had no political representation or voting rights. The proposal sparked outrage among Rome's elite women, but only one among them stood before the triumvirs to speak. Hortensia, in the Roman Forum, where few women had ever addressed the public, Hortensia stepped forward and delivered a scathing and logical critique. She argued that if women were not allowed to hold office, serve in the army, or participate in the political process, then they should not be forced to fund a war they had no voice in. Her speech was so compelling, so skillfully argued that the triumvirs reduced the number of women to be taxed from 1,400 to Cb. Hortensia's rhetorical brilliance was not a moment of inherited genius. It was the result of deep intellectual training, raised in a household steeped in oratory and legal debate. She absorbed the technicalities of Roman law and the power of persuasive speech. Her argument combined reason, precedent, and moral appeal, hallmarks of the best Roman rhetoric. Her speech survives in the writings of Aeon, offering a rare glimpse into how women could wield intellect and influence in a rigidly patriarchal society. Though she held no public office, her words shaped policy, and more than that, they challenged Rome's assumptions about who had the right to speak. Hortensia reminds us that scholarly women did not always hide behind scrolls or temples. Sometimes they stood boldly in the public square, armed not with weapons, but with reason. In the courtly halls of Han Dynasty, China, during a time when Confucian ideals reinforced male authority and female silence, one woman broke through the boundaries of tradition, not with rebellion, but with scholarship. Her name was Ban Zhao, and she is remembered as China's first female historian, a Confucian scholar, and a teacher of imperial princesses. Her intellect, discretion, and command of literature earned her a rare seat of influence in a deeply patriarchal world. Born around 35 CE, Banja was the daughter of the esteemed historian Ban Bao and sister of Bangu, the official historian of the Han court. After her brother died before finishing the monumental book of Han Shu, Banja was called upon to complete it. She took up the task without hesitation. Her additions were not superficial. She composed significant sections, particularly on astronomy, ceremonial rites, and biographies of notable women. Her contributions helped finalize a work that became one of the great historical records of Chinese civilization. But Banja's influence extended beyond history. Her most famous independent work, Lessons for Women, New J, became one of the most widely read texts for educating girls in traditional Chinese culture. While it promoted humility, obedience, and deference, aligning with Confucian values, it also advocated for female education. Banzhao argued that women should be literate, morally upright, and intellectually prepared for the duties of marriage and motherhood. In her words, if a woman lacked knowledge, how could she manage a household or raise children properly? Modern readers may see contradictions in her work, a woman promoting traditional gender roles while living a life that defied them. But Banzhao's genius was in her subtlety. She operated within the caste system, using accepted values to argue for broader access to learning. Her influence reached into the imperial palace, where she educated empresses and royal daughters. Her voice helped shape the moral framework of dynastic China. Banzhao didn't storm the gates of power. She walked through them with scrolls in hand, and in doing so, she opened doors for generations of women in China to pursue knowledge. In the bustling, cosmopolitan city of Alexandria during the 4th and early 5th centuries CE, stood a woman who became the embodiment of classical learning. Her name was Hypatia, a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher whose intellect drew students from across the Mediterranean. In a time when the Roman Empire was fracturing and religious tensions were rising, Hypatia remained a symbol of reason, scholarship, and the enduring power of inquiry. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a well-known mathematician and philosopher at the famed Library of Alexandria. Trained from a young age, she surpassed her father's teachings and began lecturing publicly on philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics. She taught Neoplatonism, a school of thought that emphasized logic, ethics, and the pursuit of truth through reason, a continuation of Plato's intellectual and to tradition. Her classroom wasn't confined to temples or libraries. Hypatia taught openly in the streets and forums of Alexandria, drawing large crowds of students, including both pagans and Christians. She wrote treatises on conic sections, developed improved designs for the astrolabe, and may have contributed to the preservation of Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. Though none of her original works survive, her legacy echoes in the writings of her students and peers. But Hypatia lived during a time of transformation and turmoil. Christianity was becoming the dominant force in the festooned Roman world, and Alexandria was a city rife with religious factionalism. Hypatia, a prominent pagan scholar and a public intellectual, became a lightning rod for both admiration and resentment. Her close ties to the Roman governor Orestes placed her at odds with Bishop Cyril, the powerful head of Alexandria's Christian community. In 415 CE, she was brutally murdered by a mob of Christian zealots, stripped, dragged through the streets, and dismembered in a church. Her death symbolized more than the end of her life. It marked the symbolic fall of classical learning in the West and the beginning of a darker intellectual era. Yet, Hypatia's memory endured. Medieval Arab scholars referenced her contributions. Enlightenment thinkers celebrated her as a martyr for reason, and today she stands as a lasting icon of female scholarship and scientific courage. In the scholarly world of ancient Judaism, where male rabbis dominated public discourse and interpretation of sacred texts, women were often excluded from formal education and legal authority. Yet even within these strict boundaries, Jewish women found subtle but enduring ways to participate in and shape the intellectual life of their communities. Though rarely recorded as rabbis or sages, their voices appear in rabbinic texts, midrashic commentary, and oral traditions, offering glimpses into a least hidden world of female scholarship. One such figure was Beriah, a legendary woman from the Talmudic era, believed to have lived during the 2nd century CE. She was the wife of Rabbi Meir, one of the most respected sages of his time, and the daughter of Rabbi Hananiah Benedon, Amata und der Roman Persecution. Beriah was known not only for her piety and moral strength, but also for her deep knowledge of Jewish law. The Talmud credits her with debating Hakic points with male scholars and besting them in argument, a rare recognition for a woman in that era. In one passage, she corrects her husband's interpretation of a verse from the Psalms, offering a more compassionate reading. In another, she disputes the assumptions of a fellow rabbi, using textual logic to dismantle his position. These stories were not allegories, they were acknowledgments, however exceptional, of women's capacity for intellectual engagement in sacred law. While women were generally barred from yeshivot, formal Jewish me's, they were often educated in the home, especially in prominent families. Daughters of scholars were taught to read Hebrew and Aramaic and to study Torah and ethics. These women preserved and transmitted traditions through storytelling, questions, and commentary, shaping the spiritual framework of their children and communities. Later rabbinic commentaries include references to unnamed women who offered insights into legal debates, medical knowledge, and ritual practice. Some of these contributions survive only as annotations or footnotes in larger male-authored works, yet their presence is undeniable. They form a mosaic of memory, scattered and incomplete, but rich with meaning. In a culture centered on study, Jewish women found ways to enter the conversation, not by breaking down the gates, but by speaking through them. In ancient India, long before printed books or formal universities, philosophy, poetry, and spirituality flowed through oral tradition, and in that river of wisdom, women were not silent passengers. They were voices, composers, questioners. Among the earliest and most powerful were the female sages of the Vedic and early post-Vedic periods, women whose verses still echo through Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions. One of the most striking examples comes from the Rig Veda, one of the oldest sacred texts in the world. Among its thousands of hymns are those attributed to women known as Rishikas, female heirs. Lamudra, Gosha, Apala, and others are credited with composing hymns that explored metaphysics, ritual, and inner experience. Lamudra, for instance, engaged her husband, the sage Agastya, in spiritual dialogue, challenging him to reconcile asceticism with the life of the senses. Her verses reflect not only poetic grace, but philosophical boldness. Centuries later, during the rise of devotional Bhakti movements across South Asia, female poet saints again emerged, this time with deeply personal and mystical compositions. In Tamil Nadu, Andal, a young girl adopted by a priest, wrote passionate hymns to Lord Vishnu that blended theological insight with emotional intensity. Her works are still sung today in South Indian temples. In the north, women like Nirabi, though living in the medieval period, drew from ancient traditions. Born into a royal family, Mirabi rejected social conventions, sang of her spiritual marriage to Krishna, and wandered as a devote. Her poems critiqued caste, gender roles, and religious hierarchy while expressing ecstatic love for the divine. In Buddhist tradition, the Theragatha, verses of the elder nuns composed in Pali around the 6th century BCE, captures the voices of early Buddhist women. These poems, spoken by former queens, courtesans, and lay women turned nuns, speak of enlightenment, renunciation, and the struggle for freedom. One nun, Sumangala's mother, speaks with stark clarity. I have given up my son, my wealth, my craving. I now walk in the path of peace. These women were not marginal, they were foundational. Their poetry is not just devotional, it is philosophical inquiry, social commentary, and psychological insight. Though their biographies are often lost or simplified, their words endure. For centuries, the contributions of ancient female scholars were pushed to the margins of history. Their works were omitted from canons, their names left off manuscripts, and their achievements buried beneath layers of cultural bias and institutional eraser. And yet their voices endured, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in fragments, always resisting silence. What unites the women we've explored? From in Hedwana in Suma to Banjao in China, from Hortensia in Rome to the Rashikas of India, is not just that they were rare, it's that they were persistent. They lived in societies that limited female access to formal education, public office, or authorship. But they found ways in through family, lineages, religious institutions, poetic tradition, or political crisis. They seized moments of opportunity and carved intellectual legacies with the tools available to them. Many of these women used culturally accepted roles, priestess, healer, mother, nun, not as limits, but as platforms. Enheduanna used her religious position to author hymns that shaped empires. Beria and Banjao engaged with male-dominated scholarship while advocating for women's education. Hypatia lectured in public squares. Hortensia challenged political leaders face to face. None of them waited for permission to think. But why were they forgotten? Because the systems that preserved history, scribes, monks, librarians, were overwhelmingly male and often uninterested in preserving women's stories. Over time, entire chapters of intellectual history were rewritten, filtered through the assumption that great thought was a male domain. This wasn't just loss, it was erasure. Recovering the lives and work of ancient female scholars isn't about modern identity politics projected onto the past. It's about restoring balance. It's about acknowledging that the foundations of science, philosophy, literature, and spirituality were not built by men alone. Women were always there, observing the stars, writing poetry, debating law, healing the sick, and asking hard questions about life and truth. Their stories change how we understand the past. More importantly, they challenge who gets to shape the future. Because every time we unearth a forgotten scholar, we rewrite what knowledge means and who it belongs to. And in doing so, we don't just honor their legacy, we extend it. In 1948, deep in the permafrost of the Ally Mountains, Soviet archaeologists uncovered something that would change everything we thought we knew about ancient tattooing. It wasn't just a skeleton or a few trinkets. What they found was a mummified body perfectly preserved in ice for over 2,400 years. This was the famous Pazyryk burial, and it belonged to a scion noble, and on his skin a full canvas of animal tattoos. Mythical beasts danced across his limbs in elegant curls and spirals, deer with elongated antlers, griffins with fierce claws, and fantastical felines. Mid-pounds. These weren't doodles or decorative body art. These were sacred symbols of power, identity, and status. In Science society, tattoos told stories. Who you were, what you'd done, and how high you ranked. This particular man had been buried with elaborate clothing, fine gold jewelry, and a team of sacrificed horses. But, even without all that, his tattoos alone would have revealed his elite status. The placement of the ink across his arms, shoulders, and legs suggests a tradition reserved for the nobility and warrior class. You didn't just walk into a Sian camp and ask for a tiger on your back. These designs were earned, and the domas, technique primitive, yes, but remarkably precise. They used bone or bronze needles to pierce the skin, rubbing in soot or crushed charcoal. The pain was intense, but that was part of the point. Enduring the needle was a rite of passage, a mark of toughness. And when you died, those tattoos would journey with you into the afterlife, your spirit cloaked in symbols of honor and strength. Today, the Pazyryk mummies are housed in Russian museums, but their legacy still pulses beneath the skin of tattoo artists and anthropologists alike. These inked warriors remind us that the art of tattooing wasn't born in a modern studio, but on windswept steppes, in icy tombs, and on the skin of ancient kings. And if this is what the Scions left behind, just wait until you see what the Egyptians did in the heart of ancient Egypt, long before ink met needle in modern studios. Tattoos played a different role, one rooted in magic, medicine, and ritual, while the tombs and temples of pharaohs dominate most narratives. The quiet marks on women's bodies offer another story, one far more intimate. In 1891, archaeologists discovered the mummy of a woman now, known as Amunet, a priestess of the goddess Hathor. Buried around 2000 BCE, her body bore a network of dark dots and lines stretching across her arms, torso, and thighs. These weren't decorations. They were symbols of divine protection, fertility, and ritual status, etched permanently into her skin. Tattooing in ancient Egypt appears to have been an exclusively female domain during the Middle Kingdom. Priestesses, midwives, and sacred dancers bore geometric tattoos arranged in bands and symmetrical patterns. These marks were placed deliberately, often over the abdomen, breasts, and pelvis. They likely served to safeguard childbirth, channel healing powers, or enhance ritual performances in temples dedicated to female deities like Hathor or Isis. Unlike the ornate animal tattoos of the Scythians, Egyptian designs were simple, yet powerful. Their repetition and symmetry suggest ceremonial significance, not casual artistry. Each line and dot acted as a permanent amulet imbued with spiritual force. The tools used were crude by modern standards. Bronze or copper needles, sometimes sharpened bone dipped in pigment derived from soot or indigo. The pain was considerable, but pain was part of the rite. In some cases, tattooing may have been accompanied by hymns or incantations, transforming the procedure into a sacred act. Murals from Thebes depict female musicians and dancers adorned with similar markings, suggesting that tattooed women played visible roles in planned religious life. Their movements, choreographed and rhythmic, would bring the tattoos to life during ceremonies. Where the Scythians wore their myths like armor, Egyptian women wore their prayers, stitched into flesh meant to protect, heal, and honor the divine. Next, in the far islands of the Pacific, tattooing evolved into an entire language, a biography etched across the body. In the vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean, tattooing became more than tradition. It became identity. Among Polynesian cultures, particularly in Samoa, Tonga, and the Marquese Islands, tattoos known as tatau were living texts. They carried the weight of ancestry, rank, courage, and spiritual connection. Every curve and line had meaning, and to be untattooed was in many communities to be unfinished. Unlike in Egypt or Saya, Polynesian tattoos were vast and highly visible. For men, they often extended from the waist to the knees, wrapping around the thighs, buttocks, and lower back. This elaborate design, called the paya, in Samoa could take months or even years to complete. The pain was staggering, the process brutal, but the result was a masterpiece of personal history. To wear the paya was to announce to the world one's endurance, honor, and connection to ancestors. The tools used were as symbolic as the designs themselves. Tattooists, known as tufuga, wielded handmade combs crafted from boar tusk or turtle shell. These were dipped into a soot-based pigment and struck with a mallet to drive the ink into the skin. The sound of tattooing, the rhythmic tapping of bone against bone, was as much a part of the ritual as the ink. Women too were tattooed, though their patterns were typically smaller and located on the hands, thighs, and around the mouth. In some regions, the malu, a delicate design etched across the inner thighs, marked a woman's grace, maturity, and readiness to serve her community. These tattoos, while less expansive than the men's, were equally sacred. Tattoo ceremonies were social and spiritual events. Families gathered, songs were sung, prayers were offered, blood, sweat, and ash mixed into a rite of passage that connected the living with the dead. It was believed that ancestors watched over the ritual, guiding the tufug's hand and blessing the recipient. To be tattooed in Paullinia was not a fashion statement. It was a contract between the individual, the tribe, and the gods. To refuse the tattoo could result in shame, but to accept it, that was to carry an entire lineage on one's skin. From the Pacific Islands, the tradition would echo across time, eventually colliding with missionaries, colonizers, and even prison. But long before that, in Japan, another transformation was underway. Tattoos were about to become a visual code for both devotion and defiance. In Japan, the art of tattooing evolved along two seemingly opposite paths, sacred and forbidden. Known as irizumi, these inked designs were first used in spiritual and decorative contexts, but over time they came to represent criminality, rebellion, and raw endurance. What began in devotion ended in stigma, and yet the artistry never faded. Early evidence of tattooing in Japan dates back to the John period, over 10,000 years ago. Clay figurines from this era show markings believed to represent body tattoos. These may have been connected to religious rituals, protective symbols, or shamanic status, but it wasn't until much later in the Edo period, 16,003, 1868, that flourished into a complex visual language. At first, tattoos served spiritual purposes. Some Buddhist monks had sacred Sanskrit characters tattooed on their arms, a physical manifestation of their vows and meditative focus. Certain designs were meant to protect the wearer from evil spirits or to act as permanent prayers. Others reflected a monk's personal devotion to canon, the bodhisattva of compassion. But as time passed, Yumi drifted into darker associations. During the Edo period, the government used tattoos as a form of punishment. Criminals were marked with symbols on their foreheads or arms to brand them for life. These false tattoos were not decorative. They were humiliating, designed to isolate offenders from society forever. Yet, in an ironic twist, these marks became the roots of resistance. Outlaws, gamblers, and eventually members of the Yakuza underworld embraced tattooing as a badge of honor. They transformed the stigma into a spectacle, covering their bodies with sprawling hand-poked tattoos depicting dragons, koish, tigers, geishas, and mythological scenes. The process was excruciating, often done with a long metal needle called a nomi and a steady hand, applying ink slowly over weeks or even years. These full-body tattoos hidden under clothing became symbols of strength, stoicism, and loyalty. In bathos, where clothing was removed, one's inked legacy was revealed, bold, intricate, and deeply personal. Despite being illegal or frowned upon, Ayumi survived as an underground art form. Tattooing in Japan became a mirror of society's contradictions, spiritual yet defiant, sacred yet criminal. A monk might bear ink to honor enlightenment, a gangster to honor his code. And while Japan's ink danced between light and shadow across the ocean, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were carving ink into bone to honor family, territory, and the spirit world. Long before Columbus set foot in the New World, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had already developed rich, diverse traditions of tattooing, each deeply tied to land, lineage, and the sacred. From the Arctic tundra to the jungles of Central America, body ink served as a living record of one's heritage, achievements, and spiritual standing. Among the Inuit of the Arctic, tattooing was often a female rite. Våmenvåre, fine dark lines across their faces, on the chin, cheeks, and forehead, etched, using a method both primitive and precise. Threads were dipped in soot and pulled under the skin with bone needles. These facial tattoos were more than adornments. They marked a woman's readiness for marriage, her connection to the spirit world, and her ability to endure pain. Some even believed the tattoos guided souls into the afterlife. Further south in the forests and plains of North America, many tribes such as the Sioux, Osage, and Hawanosi used tattoos to signal rank, bravery, and tribal affiliation. A warrior might receive a tattoo for acts of courage in battle, each design representing a specific feat or kill. These tattoos were earned, never given lightly, and the stories they told were known throughout the community. The process often involved sharp tools made from obsidian or fishbone with pigment derived from charcoal or ground minerals. Tattooing ceremonies were communal and sacred. Elders, shamans, or designated tattooists would perform the rites, often accompanied by chants and prayers. The pain was intense, but it forged resilience and pride. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs elevated tattooing to ritual theater. Tattoos were given during religious festivals honoring gods, like Quetzalcoatl, or its designs were complex, featuring serpents, celestial bodies, or glyphs, and were placed strategically on the body for magical efficacy. Warriors bore tattoos as marks of Deccan sacrifice and status, while priests used them to channel divine energy. Across the Americas, tattooing was never just skin deep. It connected people to their ancestors, their cosmology, and their communities. Each mark was a permanent thread in the tapestry of identity. As colonization swept through the continents, many of these traditions were violently suppressed, but the ink never fully faded. It lived on in secret, in scars, in memory. And thousands of years earlier, across the sea, a mummy buried beneath volcanic ash would leave behind the world's oldest known tattoos, and a mystery still not fully solved. In 1991, two hikers in the Ursal Alps near the Austria-Italy border stumbled upon what they thought was a frozen mountaineer. What they had actually found was a man, frozen in time, over 5,000 years old. He would be named Ötzi, and his body would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But beyond his clothing, tools, and mysterious cause of death, Ötzi carried something even more intriguing: tattoos, 61 of them to be exact. Unlike the decorative or symbolic tattoos found in other ancient cultures, Ötzi's marks were simple, groups of parallel lines and crosses located on his ankles, knees, lower back, and wrists. They weren't placed for aesthetics. Their locations aligned almost perfectly with areas of joint stress or injury, as identified by CT scans and X-rays. This led researchers to believe tattoos may have served a therapeutic purpose, much like acupuncture. The ink itself was made from soot or ash, applied by making small cuts in the skin and rubbing in the pigment, a method consistent with other early tattooing practices. It's astonishing to think that 3,300 years before the birth of Christ, people in prehistoric Europe were using ink and blade not just for identity or ritual, but possibly as medicine. C's tattoos stand as the oldest known preserved tattoos in human history. They offer a rare direct glimpse into prehistoric life, a world without written language, but one where the body could still speak. Each line etched into his skin may have been a cry for pain, relief, a mark of survival, or a mixture of both. And the fact that these markings endured for millennia beneath glacial ice is nothing short of extraordinary. Unlike the ceremonial tattoos of Egyptian priestesses or the warrior ink of Polynesians, Ötzi's body art wasn't about honor or status. It was about function, perhaps even healing. But in that raw practicality lies something deeply human, the instinct to leave a mark, to use the body as both record and remedy. Us ink reminds us that tattooing didn't begin in temples or tribes. It began in pain, in survival, in ancient mountains where every scar told a story. And while his were the earliest, they were far from the last. In the highlands of Southeast Asia, tribal tattooing became an entire rite of passage, a symphony of courage, blood, and generational memory. In the dense highlands of Southeast Asia, tattooing became a living chronicle, etched in pain and pride. Among the Rizeros, for the Prizuru, peoples of Borneo, the Philippines, and northern Thailand, ink was inseparable from identity. It marked adulthood, warriorhood, spiritual favor, and deep connection to ancestors. Far from decoration, tattoos were treated as sacred inheritances, each line a testament to belonging, bravery, or balance with the spirit world. In the Kinga region of the Philippines, the tradition of BK thrived for centuries. This ancient form of tattooing was performed almost exclusively by women, known as Mamba Batk, using a thorn from a calamani tree or a sharpened citrus spine as the needle and soot or charcoal as pigment. The tattooer would rhythmically tap designs into the skin with a wooden stick. The process was slow and painful, but that pain was part of the rite. For Kinga warriors, each tattoo marked a successful headhunting expedition. The more Inca a man had, the more respect he commanded. These tattoos weren't just worn, they were earned. The chest, arms, and even the face could be covered with intricate, geometric patterns, stylized animals, and ancestral motifs. These were not individualistic statements. They were social proof, carried with the weight of tradition and responsibility. Women, too, bore tattoos not for warfare, but as rites of beauty, fertility, and readiness for marriage. Their ink represented grace, spiritual cleanliness, and familial lineage. It was common for mothers to pass down patterns and placements to daughters, creating living lines of heritage etched into skin across generations. In Borneo, dark tattoo culture expressed similar values. Spirals, rosettes, and animal motifs were not only beautiful, they were guides in the afterlife. It was believed that tattoos glowed in the spirit world, lighting the soul's journey after death. A person without tattoos might become lost in the afterlife, unable to find their ancestors. As in many cultures, colonization and missionary influence nearly extinguished these traditions. Tattoos were deemed pagan, primitive, or shameful, but elders in remote villages continued their craft in secret, preserving what they could. Today, there is a revival. Descendants of tattooed warriors and priestesses are reclaiming Bartok, not as fashion, but as legacy. The old patterns are re-emerging, proving that while ink can fade from skin, it rarely fades from memory. Across the sweeping deserts and rocky highlands of North Africa, the Amaze, commonly known as the Berbers, developed a tattoo tradition unlike any other. In this fiercely independent matrilineal culture, tattoos were not hidden away on shoulders or thighs. They were worn boldly on the face, etched between the eyes, across the cheeks, or beneath the chin. Each mark was a sentence in a language older than writing. The story passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation. Berber tattoos known as tishboot served many purposes. At the most basic level, they were aesthetic, believed to enhance a woman's beauty or express her maturity. But on a deeper level, they were spiritual and protective. A small cross tattooed between the brows, for instance, was said to guard against the evil eye. Lines extending from the chin could signal a woman's marital status, tribal origin, or spiritual devotion. For Berber women, the act of tattooing was also a rite of endurance and agency. The tools were simple: a sharpened thorn or needle dipped into a blend of soot, indigo, or even powdered herbs. The skin was pricked and rubbed repeatedly until the pigment set, often accompanied by songs, laughter, or prayers. This was not just a cosmetic experience. It was communal and sacred. Some motifs carried deeply personal meanings. A triangle might represent fertility, or a connection to the goddess Tanit, a pre-Islamic deity associated with life and protection. Dots, stars, and crescent reflected celestial beliefs or ancestral spirits. In many villages, a tattooed face was considered a map of a woman's soul, but these traditions came under threat. With the spread of Islam across North Africa, tattooing began to clash with religious doctrine. Many Muslim scholars considered permanent body modification to be haram, or forbidden. As a result, the practice slowly declined. What once marked a woman's honor became viewed by some as a sign of backwardness. Yet, in remote mountain regions, elder women still bear these marks with quiet pride, living testaments to a time when stories were carved into skin instead of written on paper. Anthropologists and descendants alike are now racing to document this fading legacy before it disappears entirely. And finally, as the needle traces its path through centuries and continents, one question remains: How did tattooing transform from a sacred rite into a modern subculture? That answer lies in the global collision of colonization, criminalization, and cultural revival. As the 20th century unfolded, the ancient art of tattooing found itself caught in a whirlwind of colonization, stigma, and reinvention. What was once sacred, communal, and symbolic became in many parts of the world misunderstood or vilified. Colonizing powers, particularly from Europe, viewed indigenous tattoo traditions through a lens of superiority and religious judgment. Across continents, from Africa to Polynesia, from the Americas to Southeast Asia, traditional tattooing was suppressed, outlawed, or labeled as barbaric. Missionaries condemned it as heathen. Governments banned it as a mark of criminality or social deviance. In Japan, the Meiji government made tattooing illegal in the late 1800s, fearing it would embarrass the country on the world stage. In the Philippines, tattooed warriors were forced to hide their heritage beneath Western clothes. In North America, indigenous tattooing was driven underground by assimilation policies and boarding schools, and in many Muslim-majority regions, tattoos were quietly erased under the shadow of religious taboos. But the ink never truly disappeared. It simply went quiet. In the shadows of ports, prisons, and subcultures, tattooing evolved. Sailors brought back ink from distant lands, marking their journeys on their bodies. In the West, tattoos became linked to rebellion, favored by circus performers, bikers, and those living on the edge of societal norms. The artistry shifted from sacred to subversive. Then something changed. By the late 20th century, tattooing began to resurface, not as taboo, but as a form of personal expression. Indigenous artists across the world started reclaiming their ancestral styles, reconnecting with the stories inked into their bloodlines. Revivalists in Samoa, Borneo, and the Comte Arctic reintroduced ancient tools and rituals. In North America, native tattoo practitioners began relearning and reteeing nearly lost traditions. Today, tattooing is experiencing a renaissance. It's become global, hybrid, and digital, yet also more reverent of its roots than ever before. Modern tattoo studios exist alongside tribal ceremonies. Instagram flash sheets sit beside bone tools and hand-tapped ink. What was once nearly erased is now being proudly reclaimed. Tattooing began as ritual transformed through repression and has returned as a bridge between past and present, between the personal and the ancestral. In every dot, line, and symbol lives the echo of those who came before: Scythian nobles, Egyptian priestesses, Polynesian warriors, and countless others who chose to wear their story in skin.